There are biases and restrictions this blog self-imposes because of combinations of the format and the author. I ultimately am not going to be a person who gives you a particularly strong take on Nintendo Entertainment System games. I didn't play them. They don't have a strong nostalgic pull for me. And when I go and enter the spaces of these games, it's always going to be as an outsider learning old things anew for the first time. That may be interesting, and indeed, I do not wish to devalue anyone who is doing such work. But in my case especially, because none of these things are fundamentally important to me, it's very easy to feel like they aren't important at all. The lexicon of these games, the culture of them was not a thing I marinated in, and therefore, for the most part, the games presented are just another set of icons in someone else's story. I very often feel, when the conversation around video games comes up, that I am regularly a person who is not included in the history of video games because my primary interest was the PC and not any of the consoles. The idea that I would be neither a Nintendo or a Sega person, given my age, is seen as odd. But that means that the history of the games of my own youth, and the games that I played and the ways that they influenced me, often get left invisible, and it can be challenging to talk about some of them. For some, it's just a matter of capture. I don't know if you've noticed this, but DOSBox games don't tend to come out particularly well on YouTube usually. There's choppiness and there's tearing and there's all sorts of dark magic you have to do to make them look okay. But that's for the games that actually have graphics. What do you do about the games where the only animation you get is a flashing text parser, a little on and off cursor? The Zork games are important in a big capital I way to PC gaming. For a time there, they were considered to be the most pirated piece of software in the world. There is a straightforward, deliberate ridiculousness of Zork. If you were to look at the Zork universe now holistically, it's undeniably the kind of stuff that you might consider to be a bit webcomic-y, a bit monkey cheese, with a deliberate referential nature that tries to be original in ways that only underscore the ways it's not original. At its root, the Zork series is a set of games set in a universe that wants to be comedic and is primarily informed by the comedy tastes of people who mostly re-watched the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This isn't to say that they are bad games, but they definitely have a lot of elements to them that, politely speaking, are user hostile. When Douglas Adams worked on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and another game, Bureaucracy, which is a little less well known, he remarked that he enjoyed the ways that the games were not just not user-friendly, but were user-mendacious. He saw it as entertaining to make the game so that it could fail in interesting ways. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this is informed by the big final puzzle of that game, requiring you to deliver one of 13 random items that are distributed throughout the game world. And if you don't have one of the items, it will always pick that item, which means getting to the end of the game slowly expands until you realize you have to get to the end of the game with all of the possible items. There is no getting around it. The only solution is to correctly get everything. This is kind of the mindset of a lot of these early narrative adventures. The games are built with a sort of confrontational resentment of the player, a desire to ensure that the player is really getting their money's worth, but also is kind of suffering for daring to want the sort of stuff that the game is presenting. Now, part of this is also being restrained by form and function. See, back in the day of the PC, especially the early days, games were remarkably affordable to pirate and remarkably expensive to buy. A new video game could cost $70. A blank floppy disk could cost $2. And that meant that for games that easily fit on one floppy disk and could be copied and moved around fairly conveniently, you really were at an odds to try and make the game maintain its street value, as it were. When you start dealing with this as a creator, You can either try and make better and better forms of software copywriting, which is very difficult and very challenging, and the people at Infocom were by all accounts not great at it, or you can try alternate strategies. A very common type of copy protection at the time was manual copy protection, where there would be at the start of the game a prompt that would ask you to find a particular word on a particular page and to type it in, or similar things like the code wheel from Monkey Island. But in these early days, what Infocom tried instead was a form of copy protection where the manual was essential to finishing the game, not because of a specific bit of code, but because the manual literally contained most of the information that the game deliberately obscured. Beyond Zork is the fourth Zork game. It's also possibly one of the earliest examples of a computer RPG in the PC's nascent days. There were obviously other people doing similar things, plenty of different types of games in the same space, and you can even argue that the original Zork and Adventure were definitely trying this stuff. But it wasn't until Zork's Beyond Zork you got that kind of stats, inventory management monsters that are semi-regular, semi-random, randomly generated maps that you really saw becoming staple to the genre later on when we got more visual interfaces. For a game released in 1987, Beyond Zork has what was at the time a stunning amount of depth, particularly because it was, like the other Zork games, pushing procedural generation. Procedural generation, that thing that kind of drives a large chunk of the indie gaming industry and is core to leveling up mechanics in other parts of the professional game space, was getting some of its earlier, shakier steps here. It wasn't like Beyond Zork was doing something completely new either. There were multi-user dungeons and online games that were absolutely playing in this exact same space. But Beyond Zork was the first Zork game that really codified itself as, well, what you would recognize now as an RPG. All through a text interface, but it had a bit of a map. It had puzzles. It had some things in general relationship to one another, but not definite relationship to one another. Different chunks of level would be featured in different ways. Some items would be available in different areas, and that meant that some encounters could be a lot easier and some could be a lot harder depending upon which of the important magical items you got. The plot of Beyond Zork, such as it can be said, is that someone disturbs the gods, who are in this case literally avatars for the Infocom staff, and they wind up dropping an important relic known as the Coconut of Yendor into the mortal realm, and then they assign you to go get it back. This is fine as far as these adventure hooks go. The thing is, you're the reason that they knocked it off the edge of heaven in the first place, because you go to heaven to muck around for no good reason. It's a very interesting kind of motivationless game. When you look at what goes in to Beyond Zork, you can tell that there were people striving very hard to push against the limits of a game system that they ultimately couldn't do enough to change. Because these games had to be funny. Infocom were renowned for funny games. These games had to be engaging. They were renowned for their engaging and enraging games. These games had to make use of their established physical props that made the game copy protection work, known as feelies. And so, if you go and play Beyond Zork now, you do actually need to play it with another window holding open all the game information from the manual that is not presented in the game. This, ironically, makes it more of a game with a walkthrough than you'd typically expect of a narrative adventure these days. When you walk away from games, often what you hold on to is, in some cases, the true friends you made along the way. For me, in Beyond Zork, there are a very small number of things that stick with me. Certain words I learned from it. For example, I learned the word burin, which is a type of writing implement, thanks to this game needing it for a puzzle. And you couldn't use any other word. You had to use the word burin. I also learned the word minx from this because they use it for a joking term for a fantasy creature. In Beyond Zork, one of the final puzzles involves encountering a baby Gru. If you're familiar at all with the Gru from Zork, the Gru is really just a manifestation of dickish development spite. The nature of the Grue is that when you go into a dark space, if you do not have a light source, the game will warn you once it's dark in here, you could be eaten by a Grue. If you do not immediately leave or turn on a light, the next action, regardless of what it would do otherwise, is you are eaten by a Grue. The Grue became something of a symbol for the Infocom people to represent the mendacity of the developers. There is a baby Grue in Beyond Zork, and it seems that the solution to one of the puzzles involves killing it. But you have a compassion stat in this game, and if your compassion is too high, you can't bring yourself to kill the baby Grue. This can create, for players getting through the game the first time, a sudden revelation that throughout the game various actions that have increased their compassion have been pushing them away from the finale of the game, that suddenly there is a new management element, and then you restart the game and you make a new adventure and you're a little more careful about the ways your compassion can go up. You're a little bit more of an asshole. You maybe kick the unicorn, as it were. And then you get to the end of the game again, you kill the baby Grue, and find out that no, that wasn't the solution that won you the game. Instead, the solution is to get an even greater compassion, to get your compassion to the highest level possible, to instead go through the whole game as kindly as possible, and to solve the world by being kind. Eventually, you encounter the baby Grue, and it can't bring itself to fight you because you are too kind. And the Grue, the greatest Grue of all, the source of all evil, looks upon you and goes, no, I can't hurt you. Game ends, you get the coconut, you go back, take it back up to heaven, and the implementers continue having their lunch. What I'm saying is that Beyond Zork was Undertale before there ever was an Undertale.